All right. So before we start, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting this webinar and recognise their continuing culture and contribution. And we thank all their elders past and present and extend this respect to other Indigenous peoples. So today we'll be looking at the ways at which we can explore the National Library's collection to inform our writing, whether it's researching the setting of a specific place, finding character through biography and personal papers, or discovering stories based on historical events. Whether you're looking at recounting the facts in historical non-fiction writing or creating new stories based around those settings, I hope you find today's session useful for getting you started on your research with our collections. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover in the next hour, but there will be opportunities for questions as we go. Okay. So, to start, I wanted to give you some examples of how writers have been using our collections. Dr. Gabrielle Carey, who was a National Library Fellow in Australian Literature last year, underwent research focused on the personal papers of Australian writer Ivan Southall, looking at the hundreds of letters in the collection written to him from his readers, mostly young adults, through the 1960s and 70s. Through understanding the unique reader-writer relationship built through this correspondence, she was able to explore new perspectives on Southall's work and on Southall himself through his own personal relationships with his family, particularly his father. As both a creative writer and a creative thinker and a critical writer about literature, Dr. Carey was able to approach this body of work on a number of levels in exploring and understanding these relationships, which formed the basis of her recent book, Falling Out of Love with Ivan Southall. Shastra Dio was one of last year's National Library Summer Scholars. Shastra is a writer of poetry who uses research to construct her work in the same way that writers of historical fiction might. Her research at the library explored the medical history of World War I with a particular focus on field surgery, looking at official reports such as published histories and comparing them with personal accounts contained in wartime diaries, letters, and journals of participants. Reflecting on this experience, she finds her creative work as a happy side effect from immersing herself in archival records, creating a speaker or persona based on the text that she reads, and then plays at writing a poem, even if it's just as the means of processing and absorbing the collections. The creative work is more something that she's happy to let develop on its own as she reads and internalizes her research. Of course, we have a whole range of writers who reach out to us for help connecting with the collections, whether they're novelists, biographers, playwrights, journalists, etc. These are but a few of the kinds of questions that we often receive through our Ask a Librarian service. One question here is asking about the social conditions of life in Adelaide in 1973. Another looks for personal papers for writing biography, another for details around a murder case in the 1890s, and another is asking about legislation that regulated the nightlife of Melbourne in the late 1960s. Many of these kinds of questions seek to investigate real people and places from the past as a way of both remaining historically faithful, but also immersing themselves in these landscapes or personas. To highlight the significance of the National Library to these kinds of endeavours, it's important to touch upon why we have a National Library. The library's role, as defined by the National Library of Australia Act of 1960, is to ensure that documentary resources of national significance relating to Australia and the Australian people, as well as significant non-Australian library materials, are collected, preserved, and made accessible. As outlined in our strategic priorities, this is described as collecting today what will be important tomorrow and connecting communities with their national collections. As such, the main strength of the National Library is in its Australian collection materials, which make up the vast majority of the collection. We receive a copy of almost everything that is published in Australia through the legal deposit requirements of the Copyright Act and curate collections of unpublished materials. We also actively collect material from Asia and the Pacific, including languages other than English, and selectively collect other overseas materials of significance to Australia. In this collection, the library has around 260 kilometres of material, or approximately 10 million items. And every year we add to that with roughly 2 to 7 kilometres more. Of course, in this digital age, there are enormous collections of digital content also being collected each day, from ebooks to archived websites and born digital materials. So to give you more of a breakdown of this collection, we have print collections, which include all kinds of government publications, monographs, i.e. books, serials, such as magazines, newspapers, and journals. And as I mentioned, we receive these through legal deposit, which means that if it was published, we should have it in our collection. Then we come to some of our more interesting things. We have over 600,000 maps in our collection. We also have our Ephemera Collection, which includes various kinds of print material, such as catalogues, menus, programs, and flyers. We have an extensive picture collection, including artworks such as paintings, etchings, and sketches, as well as photographs and posters. And a collection that you'll probably be quite interested in accessing for research is the Manuscript Collection. These are often personal papers of individuals or families of national significance, but can also include corporate records and archives, such as those belonging to a company, association, or political party. Finally, we have the Oral History and Folklore Collection, which records the voices that describe Australia's cultural, intellectual, and social life, including over 45,000 hours of recordings of interviews and traditional music. So, you might be wondering, that's all great, but how does it all work? How do I find and get these collections? Well, firstly, it's important to note that unlike some libraries that you might be familiar with, we are a non-lending library, which means you can't take collections home with you. Most of the physical collections are held in storage, either inside the building or at an off-site storage facility. So you can't actually browse the shelves. Instead, you need to search for collections using our catalogue, which you can also use to request items and have them delivered to our reading rooms for viewing. And in order to do that, you need a library card. So I'm going to put up a quick poll, just out of curiosity. How many of you have a National Library card? So as you can see, the vast majority of us, of you have a library card, which is great to hear. For those of you who don't have one, it's pretty straightforward to get one. If you're here in Canberra, you can actually just come to the main reading room and fill out the online form. But if you're from home, if you're away from Canberra, it's still a pretty straightforward process of going to the main website, which looks like this. And looking for the words, get a library card. And that will take you to an online form where you can fill in your details. Once you've done that, you can come to us in the main reading room, or if you're not based in Canberra, we can mail your card out to you, which is still quite valuable for either requesting your materials in advance before visiting Canberra or accessing e-resources from home. So once you have a card, you can request these materials from the catalogue. To find the catalogue, again, go to the library's website and click on the catalogue, which may seem obvious, but it can be easy to get lost on our website. Sometimes people will search in the search site field in the top right-hand corner or get lost in some of our menus, but we've tried to make it easy by putting the catalogue in the middle of the main home page. So have a look out for that. And again, on our website, you can either search straight away or you can just click on catalogue and you're into our catalogue for searching. So on this note, as I mentioned before, a lot of our collections are physical collections, which you will have to visit the library for. But some of our collections are available for viewing online. This includes some digitized newspapers and journals, generally pre-1955, but there are exceptions such as the Canberra Times and the Australian Women's Weekly, which are all accessible through Trove. along with pictures, maps, manuscript materials, and streaming recordings of oral history and folklore interviews. You'll find a couple of clues on the catalogue that will indicate that you can access it online. There'll often be an accompanying thumbnail picture in the case of pictures that you can click on to view. There'll also be a link in the catalogue to a National Library of Australia digitised item, both in the record and the bottom of the record under online, which you can click on to view. However, if these options don't present themselves, you will need to request the materials to view in person. And to do this, you would click Request This next to the item on the catalogue record. I'm not going to do this right now, but we'll see opportunities later on where you can see how that works. Once you've requested the item, you'll see the word Success, and it will take you to where you need to go to access. It will tell you where you need to go to access the material. The library has two reading rooms, the main reading room and the Special Collections reading room, which you can use to access these collections. Depending on the collection materials, you'll need to go to one of these places, either the central desk or the newspaper and family history section of the main reading room, or the Special Collections reading room. When you request materials, we'll deliver the items to the reading room for you to use, and all items are held for 7 days from the date of the request. So I know what you're thinking. What if I want to access something in the library's collection and it isn't digitized? This does happen quite a lot, since the reality of holding such a large and growing collection is that the vast majority of it still hasn't been digitized yet. However, we do have a Copies Direct service that allows you to custom order copies of collection material and have it emailed or sent to you. You should also note, though, that this is subject to copyright laws and rights agreements that we may have with the donors of collection materials. So that covers a lot of the boring procedural stuff that you need to know to get started. Before we continue to some more interesting content, do we have any questions so far? No questions? Oh. Anne, I see you've raised your hand. Did you have a question for us? Okay. Well, if you have a question, pop it in the Q&A. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. There are various charges for the Copies Direct service, yes. It depends on a number of factors, what you're wanting a copy of and what format you want it in. Off the top of my head, I'll quickly jump into the website. And you can look at this later if you need to, but go to a Copies Direct page. Wrong place. I'm going to take a shortcut and put the address right in there. So copiesdirect.nla.gov.au, and should be payment details here somewhere. How much do these copies cost? There we go. So we've got some an indication of the various costs here. Again, if you want to make a note of that address, then you can come back to it and view it at your own leisure. Do you have any other questions? If not, keep thinking. If you have a question, pop it in the Q&A form, but otherwise I will continue. So, an important part of literary research involves building the geographical and social setting of a place. Whether it's a colonial settlement, a bustling city, or a quiet country town, there are plenty of materials in our collections that can tell you about a specific location. By the way, this is a real wall map from our collection. If you happen to be writing a story about sheep and wheat farmers living in Australia in the 1920s, you might find it useful. So firstly, and this seems obvious, we need to know the name of the place that we're researching. For many of our collections, if it's related to a specific place, such as a town, city, or even a hotel or church, then this will be included in the catalogue record. However, there are a few things to bear in mind. Some places can be ambiguous with names such as Kensington, Windsor, or Sandringham, in which case you should clarify using the state as well. If you don't get many results, consider wider government areas such as the name of a shire. And finally, be mindful of historical place names that may have changed, particularly things like parish names. Quite often, you won't have been the first person to be researching a place, and historical society publications can be a great starting point, both to get an overview of a place and also find references to other primary sources that the library might hold. So here, if you search for a place name on the catalogue, along with the phrase historical society, then this would be a good start. So for example, Apollo Bay and Historical Society. And you'll see that we have quite a few resources that tell the history of the Apollo Bay, which is a place that I randomly picked, but it seems like an interesting place. But for example, if you search for another place, such as say Cooktown, go to the other end of Australia, again, we have some interesting resources about the history of Cooktown prepared by their historical societies. Atlases and street directories can also be very insightful for showing how roads and properties have changed through the years, especially those street directories that come out every year or so. In this case though, one of my favourite of the oldest street directories is the suburb atlas of the suburbs of Sydney, which is fully digitised. And you can look through. This was published back in the 1880s and shows you the various older suburbs of Sydney, where you can really zoom in and out to quite good detail. And I really could spend quite some time just flicking through this and imagining what life was like in the 1880s, but we've got more to do. Similarly, yeah, you can get a sense of how new suburbs have popped up over certain periods of time. So in Melbourne in the 1960s, back in 67, a bit over 50 years ago, this area of the eastern suburbs of Melbourne was largely well, a lot more sparse, but you can see it growing through the 70s until the 80s, when it became much of the rest of the leafy eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And similarly, publications like street directories can also provide you with glimpses of aspects of society from a certain time, such as the list of drive-in cinemas that were present in the 60s, or information on how you might go about catching a train using the public transport system back in 1988 in Melbourne. Moving on to our map collection, topographic maps can give you a real sense of the landscape. And this is a great one because not only does it show things like the coastline and the contours of what is quite a hilly and rugged area, but like many of our maps, this one is fully digitized. And so you can view it online. Just wait for it to load. And again, what's really great is that you can zoom in and see quite a bit of the detail. And I quite like some of the place names here, which again give you a sense of the landscape. Places like Black Hill and Eagle's Nest, which I imagine would provide quite excellent views overlooking these cliffs here. Gentle Annie Hill, which I could picture being a nice Saturday afternoon stroll. Or my personal favourite, Burst My Gall Hill, which I imagine might be more challenging. And also note, while these days the town is called Apollo Bay, back then was called the township of Cranbrook. So that's worth noting if you're doing some research on the history of this place. Parish and cadastral maps can show who owned the land and property at certain historical points of time, which again is a good way of linking places to the people who lived there. So this is an old sketch map showing the, I guess, a lot of the ownership of the land around what became Canberra. And then there are other kinds of maps that can tell a different kind of story. The Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works plans can often show details of specific buildings. Here's one from Hawthorne in Melbourne, which shows some of the banks and hotels in that area back in the turn of the century. And similarly, the fire underwriting maps in Sydney show a lot of internal details of buildings, such as whether if they had a fireplace, and they often include information such as the materials they were built with. And again, note that many of these are digitized at other libraries, such as the State Library of Victoria in the case of the MMBW plans, and the State Library of New South Wales in the case of the fire accident underwriting maps. But heading back to Apollo Bay, local newspapers can be a valuable way of focusing your research onto a local community, not only through the stories of day-to-day goings-on, but also the advertising pages that show the various businesses that were in operation. While many of the major metropolitan newspapers have already been digitized and are accessible through Trove, there are smaller local newspapers also being progressively added. So we can see here, we go to our Trove digitized newspapers, which look like this, and search for the phrase Apollo Bay. Many of the results come up for the Colac Herald, which you can see here, after the two major newspapers, which would have been a local newspaper for the area. And again, you can go in and start to look at, just to pick one at random, and start seeing the kind of stories about incidents going on in the area. However, if it's not digitized, you can also request many of these newspapers to be delivered to the main reading room on microfilm. And to be viewed in the newspaper and family history area. And we talked a bit about how to request materials. If you go to a catalogue record at the bottom, you click in the library and you would click request this. It's going to ask you for your user ID and family name, but then you can use that, which will be on your library card, and then you can use that to request materials for the reading room. And again, if you're not able to come to Canberra, you can also see if the microfilms can be sent to you via your local library on interlibrary loan. Moving on to pictures, photographs can often show what places looked like at different times, and they can complement the maps in that respect. If you think back to that coastal map of Apollo Bay, you can see from here the township and the rugged hilly coastline in the background. And similarly, promotional material, such as tourism posters from the pictures collection and advertising material, can also be found in geographic ephemera, such as pamphlets, accommodation guides, and postcards. And these show more of the social aspects of life in this place, such as how it was marketed to audiences and what people did there for fun. Now that we've established our setting, I wanted to move on possibly to a more interesting part of the research, the people. A little while ago, I was helping a reader from Newcastle research the life of Florence Austral, who was a world-class opera singer, and she died 50 years ago. So once again, and once again, if we're searching on the catalogue, we would look for collection materials that are specifically related to that person. And in this case, it would be catalogued under the name Florence Austral. we get the following helps about. It's very important that you spell people's names correctly as well. Otherwise, you won't get the results you want. And so when we search for those names, we get the following kinds of results. And as you can see, we've got a selection of books, pictures, a painting, 4 books, some music, some ephemera from concerts, some personal ephemera, some personal papers, and yeah, and a scrapbook. So it's a really interesting variety of different results that have come up just from searching for that person's name. Note that the name Florence Austral is quite a unique name, but other names can be more ambiguous, such as John Clark. Here we have John Clark the bushranger, John Clark the theatrical producer, John Clark the satirist, and another guy by the name of John Clark, whose images are all found in the National Library's collections. Obviously, they're not the same person. Some helpful hints would be to look at the life dates in the catalogue record and check that you've spelt their name correctly. In terms of books, if the person is of some cultural or historical significance, there will often be a written biography which can give you an overview of their life. The Australian Dictionary of Biography is a good starting point, and one advantage to the Australian Dictionary of Biography is that it's also freely available online. Similarly, the Who's Who of Australia is a great resource, although for the Who's Who, you'll need to know the year that the person was significantly active in. Speaking of books, the library has many collections that have previously passed through the hands of prominent people in the past. And through looking at the provenance of the book, we can also find some interesting details of that person's life and their interests. Some of our collections come from name collections, such as the Nankerville and Ferguson collections, being some of the more significant. By looking across these formed collections, we can also come to understand the interests of the person who collected them and piece together lists of books that were previously owned by individuals by searching on the catalogue for their name and the word's former owner. For example, we have a collection of materials formerly owned by George Mackiness. And again, in the catalogue, there'll be an entry here that says Mackiness George, former owner. And by clicking on that subject heading, you can see the rest of the books that he collected, which ended up in the National Library. Many of these books will also have personalised book plates, which in themselves tell you a lot about the character and the story of the owner. For example, we have here a book plate found in a book from the collection of Sir Rex Nankerville, which tells us a bit about this person and his areas of interest. Nankerville collected material documenting explorers such as Dampier, Tasman, Cook, Flinders, and in particular Bligh, which are depicted in the names on this map in the illustration. The tiki represents his interest in the Pacific region, and similarly, the books here name a number of prominent artists whose works he collected. If the person that you're researching was active prior to 1955, then Trove's newspapers are another excellent place to search for people. Continuing our example of researching Florence Austral, a search for her name in this resource will bring a multitude of results. And again, I've just searched the name Florence Austral in the digitized papers. And what's quite interesting is if you open up, you can see that the vast majority would have been back in the 1920s and 30s, particularly in the 30s when she reached worldwide acclaim. If the person that you're looking for is more recently active, then there's still a chance that there was a story published in the Canberra Times or other publications such as the Australian Women's Weekly, for which we have more recently digitised issues. The Sydney Morning Herald archives from 1955 to 1995 is also a fantastic electronic resource, which you can access through the library's e-resources using a library card. And this provides full to digitize full text from the period through to 1995. Some of you may be familiar with the Ryerson Index. This is a great online tool for finding death notices and obituaries, which can also be a valuable source of information when researching a biography. And if we wanted to search for Florence Austral, we would put in here, I'll just search for, and no results found. But because I've already done a bit of research, I realized that her Florence Austral was actually a pseudonym, and her actual surname was Amadio. If you search for Florence Amadio, there we are. And one of them even references her pseudonym, Florence Austral. And from this, I find that I can find some information. Clearly, these are two different people, but we already know that she died in 1968, so I can dig up the Sydney Morning Herald for the 22nd of May, 1968, and find that obituary, which I have included here. We also have biography files. These are clippings files that were developed by the library mostly in the 1960s and 70s. Unfortunately, these files are rarely comprehensive, but they can still be valuable in finding obscure articles that haven't been indexed anywhere else. Ephemera collections can also be a great source of materials. In the case of Florence Austral, there is an extensive collection of programs from her performances, both within Australia and overseas, as part of our prompt collection of performing arts programs and ephemera. It's also worth looking at organisations and venues that the person was associated with. In this case, we have an extensive range of ephemera material from the Promenade concerts at the Royal Albert Hall in London, where Austral performed. And again, photographs can tell a story. And here you can see that we have many photographs of Florence Austral, both in her early roles in costume and then touring Australia as her popularity increased. Similarly, artists' works such as painted portraits can tell its own story through the artist's interpretation. And again, and then there are manuscript collections. The library often collects personal papers, which can include valuable insights such as notes, letters, and diaries. Sometimes there might just be 1 or 2 boxes of material, or then you get collections such as the Robert Menzies papers, which are made up of over 600 boxes and take up over 100 meters of shelf space. Manuscripts are often an interesting case because they aren't catalogued to the same level of detail that our other collections are, often because it simply isn't practical to. The collection is often catalogued in a single record, which briefly describes its contents, but for our collections that are larger than a few boxes, we create what we call finding aids to help researchers narrow down their search. So to give you an example, I mentioned Ivan Southwell at the beginning of the talk. If we search for his papers on the catalogue, we get this record. And we can see here from the extent that it's made up, from the description that it's made up of 145 boxes in total. But to get a sense of what's actually in those boxes, you need to click through to the finding aid. And here you can see a list of the entire collection. Scrolling through, which is divided into various series and then the files in each series. Now, of course, the level of detail is still quite limited, so you're going to need to put aside time to painstakingly go through a lot of these collections sometimes, which can be frustrating. But on the plus side, researching with manuscripts can also lead to serendipitous discoveries that you didn't even know were there. For example, one of last year's summer scholars was researching the composer Peter Sculthorpe, and amongst the personal papers, this was a recipe for what was described as pink pancakes, which he describes as an early Australian variation on the traditional pancake. If you're wondering, the vital ingredient is beetroot. Even something as simple as a recipe can reveal aspects of that person's character. Like here when he says, "I rather like the almost forgotten English custom of sounding a pancake bell at 11 in the morning on Shrove Tuesday." I cook pancakes at least once a week, but I have yet to take up the idea of sounding a bell. So the advantage to not knowing exactly what's in there is that neither does anyone else. And it's not uncommon for people to find these unique gems of personal detail, whether it's in letters and journals, or in annotated scrapbooks or signed photographs. In a way, a manuscript collection represents those personal interactions, moments and achievements that are most memorable and significant in that person's life. And by immersing yourself in those papers, you can get a sense of the world that they lived in through their activities and interactions. When researching people, there are other considerations to take into account as well. In some cases, there may not be materials related to the person you're looking for, but once you start looking at materials related to those people who are closest to them, then you may be able to find valuable information. For example, the library does not have any manuscript collections related to Florence Austral, but they do have the papers of the Amadio family, where John Amadio was Florence's husband. Similarly, archives and manuscripts of affiliated organizations can also help highlight some of the activities of a person who was involved in that organization. Okay, I'm going to take a break to answer some questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've had a few questions come through. So earlier on when you were in Trove, I think specifically around the newspapers, Joanne asked, can you combine a place search and another item? For example, Gippsland and Cobb and Co.
Oh, look, the beauty of Trove, and I'll just pop into it here. The beauty of Trove is it's a keyword search. So you're searching for a keyword. So we could do exactly that. What was it? What were the places?
Gippsland and Cobb and Co.
Gippsland, Cobb. I'm just going to go Cobb, Co. So yeah. So we can definitely do a search, and I'll pick up results that include both the place name and a company name. Alternately, you can just do a search for Cobb and Co. And then you can limit your results to Victoria, which I know isn't actually, it's probably a bad example because they were busy, they were active all over Victoria. But then you can also, from there, look at the various titles. And so we have places like Gippsland Times, Bairnsdale Advertiser. Yeah, so those would be the two that we could narrow it down to. And so now we've done a search for Cobb & Co, narrowed down to references of Cobb & Co in the Gippsland Times, and then you can narrow it down further depending on the time period. Obviously in the 1870s and 1880s is when they were most active, so you can again narrow it down by decade. And so if you're looking particularly at 1875, then we're down to 234 results. And again, you can narrow it down by month. You can refine your search by advertising articles. So if you're looking for a report about something that happened with Cobb & Co, you can narrow down all of your advertising. And then now you're down to a nice short list. And there's a reference to Cobb & Co in some news about post office arrangements. This is all a bit arbitrary, but it just gives you an example of how you can really narrow down your search from what is quite broad to start with.
Great. Charlotte just added to that with a question, does the same search for multiple keywords also work in the National Library's catalogue?
Yes. So you have the choice when you search in the catalogue. You can do from here you can do a broad keyword search. So when you do a search, let's just use the example of Gippsland, Cobb, Co. There's It's one result here. So it's probably not the best example. Okay. There's plenty in Common Code. Whereas you can also go to advanced search, and so you might do a search for Cobb and Co in the title, but you might also want to narrow it down to subject. I'm hoping transportation works as a subject heading, and there we go.
So our next question comes from Cecily, who asks, why is Peter Skull for paper entries dated 1839 to 2014? Wouldn't 1839 be a little earlier?
Yes, thank you, Cecily. We'll go back into the catalogue record for the papers of because it's an interesting situation. So yes, I can see what you mean right here in the listing. It says 1839, and if we look at the finding aid, you can see there are 3 consignments here. So it seems that the latest consignment received in 2015 contained papers which dated back to 1839. So firstly, it's not uncommon for people to have personal papers that predate their own life, especially if there are things that the person has collected or inherited, whether they're family letters or papers or scrapbooks of old articles. However, it's also entirely possible that this is simply a typographic error, and it is meant to be 1939, which would be more in line with the range of the other collections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and raise this question with our manuscripts team, and they can make their own corrections as deemed appropriate, or they might be able to add more information to the finding aid, which points out what exactly dates back to 1839, if there is something dating back to 1839.
Great. Our next question from Tom, and he asks, if a manuscript item is marked permission required for research, how do I go about getting that permission?
Okay, yes, this is also very important, and while we've got Peter Sculthorpe open, I'll use this as an example. When you're looking at the catalogue record, always look under access conditions, because it'll tell you what is available for research, if it's an open collection or if it's a closed collection. Now, in this case, some of the collections are available for research, and some requires permission research and some requires permission for research. And you can see more details down here in the library. You can see access details. So a number of boxes require permission for research until 2045. It looks like it's just parts of some boxes. So here you've got box 119, file 27, box 121, files 59 to 60, and so on. And so what this means is with many of our collections, personal papers and company records can contain sensitive or personal information that the donor doesn't want just publicly available. They would rather that the researcher sought permission just to, I guess, have a chat to the rights holder just so that they're confident that the material will be used appropriately. And so if you need to seek permission, the best way to do so is to contact the National Library directly through our Ask a Librarian service, which you can find from our homepage. We go to the homepage, have a link to Ask a Librarian, click on Inquire Now, and then just put the details of what you want to access. Say, I understand that permission is required. Can you help me seek that permission? And then what we'll do is either we'll provide you with the contact details for the person that you need to seek permission from, or we will contact the rights holder on your behalf. And so it's really important to note that this can take some time. So do check the catalogue for those access conditions before visiting us, because sometimes people arrive on the spot and didn't realize they require permission, and it can become a bit frustrating and disappointing.
Great. And our last question, I think for this question break, Joe asks, what does the abbreviation DAAO stand for? So I think that's on the slide in front of us.
Yes, yes. So my apologies. I live in a world full of acronyms and abbreviations, so sometimes I can get a bit lazy and just write ADB or DAAO. Of course, ADB, I mentioned before, is the Australian Dictionary of Biography. DAAO is the Design and Art Australia online website, and we can actually have a look at what it looks like. It's a great free online resource to find out biographical information about designers and artists from Australia. Here we've got one for Sydney Nolan, and what's great about it is you can get some. There's all the biographical there's all the vital details of their biography. We've got they actually have 2 biographies here. One appears to be a peer reviewed, so there's plenty of information if you just wanted to, if you were doing some scoping research and just needed all the basic details. But we also have things like collections. So you can see a list of all the collections that hold his artwork. Have a list of works. These are not always comprehensive, but they do often have a decent proportion of their works. It's like past exhibitions. So it's a great little resource for researching artists and designers. And of course, you can find it at daao.org.au. So yeah, check that out. Oh, and one other thing I mentioned, you can also look at associates. So these are people that they were related to or associated with, friends. They might have collaborated with them. So if you're looking for contemporaries of an artist, then this is also a really good resource for that. So, moving on. We've already looked a bit at researching places and people. Now I want to explore how we research events in history. When we think about events, they usually involve a place, a time and date, and a person. So we can use some of our earlier tactics to find information about a place and a person in our collections, and then narrow them down by the date. Similarly, there might be organizations that were involved in engaging with or organizing the event, and you should be able to find collection materials related to specific events by looking up those organizations. Regarding the kind of search terms, common phrases that we use to refer to specific events in history can vary substantially, and they're often not always consistent. There are a couple of ways to approach this issue. Firstly, you can search for popular phrases such as the bombing of Darwin or the Whitlam dismissal, and identify from the titles the items that are most relevant, and then look at the subject headings to find other matching collections. For example, here, we've searched for the phrase, the bombing of Darwin, and we get 57 results. However, when we look at some of the catalogue records, because bombing of Darwin isn't really a standardized subject heading, we can look at the catalogue records. Just find a good example. I think this one's a good one. Yes, and here we go. We can see the heading Darwin NT History Bombardment 1942, which is a much more accurate subject heading, and which refers to the bombing of Darwin in 1942. And as a result, we get 98 records when before we had 57. One of the great things about our newspapers is that if we know the date of what we want to research, then we can really narrow in on the stories that were reported as it happened. For the 2 examples I've mentioned before, the bombing of Darwin happened on the 20th of February 1942, and the Whitlam dismissal was on the 11th of November 1975. So if we go to Trove, and browse by date. We go into 1942. February, and we'll go for the 20th. And so we can look at different newspapers to see what their headlines looked like at this time. So here we had The Age, 2 air raids in Darwin, etc. Oops. Similarly, we can do a search for the 11th of November, 1975. Of course, it wasn't reported until the next day, so we'll look at the 12th of November, 1975. And there it is. Willem Sacht Fraser is Prime Minister. And again, don't forget about our Sydney Morning Herald archives through our e-resources, which also provide the Sydney Morning Herald's digitised newspapers through to 1995. Now, ephemera can be a great source of detail for small events, such as the menu of a dinner or the program at a cultural event, which might have some interesting details, such as who spoke and what was on the menu. You can also find a wide range of online ephemeral materials, such as menus, by searching for these terms in our catalogue. So I've done a search here for menus and ephemera, get 109 results. And here we have and you can also narrow down your results to NLA digital material, which will show you all of our digitized material. And here, for example, just click on any of these menus. And here's a whole collection of Christmas menus, for example. So if you're looking at how people celebrated Christmas through the years, this might be an excellent result to look at. The library also collects federal election campaign material for its ephemera collection, which can tell you a lot about the prevailing issues of the times. And then again, we have photographs, some of which have become iconic now and are very influential in the way that we view historical events. And seeing contemporary images can also help fill the gaps in the story. So if we're looking for stories about the bombing of Darwin, we can also find some pictures that can show different perspectives on that time. And of course, we're back to manuscripts. As we've already explored in our personal papers, these primary sources written by those who were there can provide a unique glimpse into one perspective on an event. At the same time, we also have manuscript collections that provide a wider range of materials surrounding an event. For example, the papers of Jesse Street and the papers of Gordon Bryant include many documents that surround the activities of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, who were very active around the 1967 referendum on the amendments to the Australian Constitution relating to Indigenous Australians. So we can see that within these papers, they've got minutes from meetings, but they also have things like flyers, circulars, badges, and newspaper cuttings from different statements they were making around this campaign. And yes, again, if we look into these papers, we can actually narrow it down to just the digitized pamphlets. Many of these have had the images repressed for copyright reasons, but we can see here one of the more famous flyers from the time are available for us to look at. Finally, when it comes to more recent events, I also recommend looking at older websites through the National Library's web archive, Pandora. Like newspapers, this is an excellent way of viewing events in the way that they were presented at the time. And often, such as is the case with the Sydney Olympics website, if you search for the term Sydney 2000, which is the name of the website, you can see that there are many recorded instances of the website. As the site changed through time, obviously with competitions each day, they were broadcasting results on a daily basis. I also recommend keeping an eye out for changes in March, as the National Library will be launching the Australian Web Archive, which will be a new platform for accessing archived Australian web content. As outlined in the beginning, we can use the online catalogue to find the vast majority of these collections, and then either view them online if they are digitised, or request them for viewing in one of the reading rooms using your library card. In terms of getting copies, depending on the number of factors, you may be able to download a copy for your own research purposes if they are digitised. Otherwise, you can either take photos of materials in the special collections room, or use the photocopier in the main reading room. Or if you're from out of town, put in a copies direct order, bearing in mind that copyright restrictions may apply to some of these collections. In circumstances where a copies direct order is not possible due to copyright restrictions, you might also consider requesting an interlibrary loan through your local library. We can provide this service from many of our published collections. Of course, the National Library isn't the only place that you should be looking. Already a few times we've been searching through Trove, and the beauty of Trove is that it can direct you to other collections, such as those in state and academic libraries. If you're curious to know more about Trove, we also have other learning program sessions that can help you familiarise more with its functions. So, we're almost done, but I'm also keenly aware this has been a lot of information to process. Fortunately, the Reader Services team is available here to help get you started or to help try and fill the gaps in your research process. We have prepared a wide range of research guides to help you connect with our collections, which you can find through our website. Again, if you start with using the library, using the library, research tools and resources, you'll see the link to our research guides. And this provides guides to things like newspapers, maps, and things like electoral rolls, Australian literature, gazettes, and so on. Click on the A to Z list to see a full list of research guides available. Of course, we'd love to know more about your own creative endeavours, especially in using our collections, so please don't hesitate to contact us if you want some assistance. You can find the Ask a Librarian link online from the website. Just look for the words Ask a Librarian. I've shown you it before, but here it is again. And inquire, and click Inquire Now. And that will take you to the online form to fill out. So we're reaching the end now, but I believe we have a few more questions.
Yes, we have a few more. So Anne has asked, can you please take us through a picture search, say looking for the works of Joseph Wolinski?
Okay, so if we're searching for works in the National Library's catalogue, we'd start through the catalogue. And what I'm going to do, type in the word Wolinski. Of course, it's important to make sure you spell these things correctly, otherwise you won't get the results you want. Now I'm selecting author here. Of course, Wolinski is an artist, but in this context, author is, it means the same thing as a creator or an artist. So we would use the author to search. And here we have a range of results. But if we narrow down the search to picture for our format, you can see that we have 3 works of art by Joseph Walensky. 2 of them have been digitized, but the 3rd one has not. And so if you wanted to look at them, you can click on the thumbnail and that will take you to the picture. And similarly, there he is with his paintbrushes. You can also search on Trove if you're wanting to search a bit broader to include other collections. And in this case, I would go to advanced search. Again, creator. And then you can go to the picture zone to see artwork by Walensky. So you can see that in addition to the 3 at the National Library, we've got 1 at the State Library of New South Wales, the Aboriginal woman in La Perouse. And we also have one at the Powerhouse Museum, which we can click through to view the Powerhouse Museum. That'll take us through to the website. And there it is. So always make sure it's great to start at the National Library, but you can also do a Trove search, which will give you a much broader range of results.
Great, thanks. Our next question comes from Lynn, who asks, access to British newspapers, is that possible through Trove using my library membership?
Okay, so Trove generally focuses, with its digitized newspapers, so Trove generally focuses on Australian content with its digitized newspapers. However, if you do have a National Library card, you can use our e-resources to search for a number of British newspapers. So here, you look at category and find overseas newspapers. So some great databases that we have are the British Newspapers Online, which have papers ranging back to 1600. Another really good one. So this is 18th century journals, which cover other kinds of periodicals, not just newspapers. The other one I'll show you. We have quite a lot of international papers. 19th century UK periodicals are good. And the Times Digital Archive is a great database because it goes all the way back from 1785 through to what is quite recent issues of the Times. Again, these are all available through your these are all available by using your library card. So if you wanted to put in your username and your ID here at the top, and then you click through to the resource, you would click accept, and that'll take you through to the database.
Excellent. All right, our last question for today comes from Judith, and she asks, so this is going back to the earlier question break. One of the early example searches you used, which was Cobb & Co. and Gippsland Times, you just searched for one newspaper title in Trove. She was wondering if there's a method of searching multiple newspapers, and she gives an example. She's searching for Saunders and Townsville Bulletin and Bowen Independent, Evening Telegraph, etc. So looking at, I suppose, a few titles, newspaper titles within Queensland.
Okay, Judith, so there is a way, it's slightly more complicated, but if we start with the digitised newspapers area, now what we want to do is go to an advanced search. So, so I did that quite quickly. I just clicked on this little button that says ADV, which is an advanced search. We want to search for Saunders. But what we can do is limit the results by a selection of titles. So we're looking at Queensland newspaper titles. So the example you've given is so we'll just find Townsville Bulletin, Townsville Daily Bulletin, the Bowen Independent. Those three titles, so I'll show you that three are selected. Click on search. See, the search has been limited to these three titles, and now you have a list of, you've got a list of results that are limited to those three titles. Now, of course, you've still got almost 9,000 results, so I definitely recommend looking at narrow it down by the decade. And perhaps how many notes that you're looking for, then that might be something that you might want to limit to. Okay.
Great. Well, that's all our questions today. Thank you, Andrew, for that.
So I hope you've enjoyed our session. You can find this recording and other recordings of other webinars through our library's website. And please keep an eye out for future learning programs. Otherwise, I wish you all the best for your literary investigations.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. We'll end today's session now, but please keep in mind we do have upcoming webinars. If you're interested, our next one will be an ebooks webinar. So please register through our website for any of those that take your interest. But thank you once again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day.